So what I'm going to talk through this morning is some of the key messages that we included in the second CoSIE positioning paper. And obviously, although I'm talking today, this was very much a group effort. There's quite a list of co-authors on the first page of the publication. I won't go through the whole list now, but this is very much a joint piece of collaboration, cooperation between various CoSIE partners. So what I'm going to try and do is talk through where we think we've got to in terms of emerging lessons from CoSIE and some of the questions that those emerging lessons are now posing for our thinking around co-creating public services. And the paper really divides that into three broad areas. The first part of the paper goes back to this issue of conceptualizing co-creation. And I think the novel element in the paper is really around this idea of making the link between co-creation and strengths-based or asset-based ways of working, and then starting to think about the underlying theories that might help us to better conceptualize co-creation. And in particular, we've looked at capabilities theory as a useful framework. And then what we've got is two broad areas of insights around implementation and evidencing and evaluating co-creation. So that's what I'm going to try and briefly talk about today. There's obviously a lot in the paper, so I can't really cover everything in detail, but I'm just going to try and give you an overview today. I guess the obvious starting point is always, what is co-creation? And we have had an understanding of co-creation that really predates, I think, this project, and some of us worked on a previous project, INASI. And we recognise that we face new challenges, and that public services face new challenges, and that these new challenges really move away from some of the original reasons that public services were developed. So climate change, people living longer and the issues of healthy aging, new forms of crime, long-term youth unemployment, a whole range of issues that are both complex and novel, and public services sometimes struggle to address them. And one of our insights is that clearly social innovation is needed within public services, and co-creation is seen as key to social innovation. And so what we've been thinking about is then, how do co-creation and social innovation come together, and how can we sort of tap into these ideas as a reform strategy for public services? So we've previously distinguished co-creation and co-production. So co-production is where people who have lived experience, who use services, work with the people who deliver services to personalize the services that they receive, to ensure that the services they receive are co-produced. Co-creation is distinct on a number of levels. One fairly simple distinction is that co-creation involves people with lived experience, people who use services, designing the overall service as well as their specific experience of the service. But we've also used work from people like Stephen Osborne, and talked about the idea of co-creation being the idea of value being created at the nexus of the interaction between people who use services and people who deliver services. So the idea of value has come in. Where I think we've now moved on to is talking about the idea of strengths-based or asset-based approaches, and we've contrasted traditional public services that operate in a deficit-based way from services that operate in a strengths or asset-based way. So the starting point here is that a lot of the thinking around co-creation is drawing on private sector practice and experience and theory. But the private sector generally assumes that people who use services have agency and capabilities sufficient to engage in co-creating those services. Whereas, of course, that isn't always the case in the public sector. Very often, people who come to public services have limits in their capabilities and their opportunities to shape services. And also, services tend to often take a deficit-based approach. They tend to see people in terms of the problem that needs to be fixed, and they tend to take a fairly short-term view of the problems people have, the needs that people have, and focus on a sort of deficit-based approach. So Nesta have kind of captured this quite well in their contrast between good and bad help. So bad help leaves people without clarity about the changes they want to make, or the knowledge and confidence and support to get there. It often only addresses a single aspect of people's lives without taking account of what else is going on. Whereas an asset or strengths-based approach recognizes that people have assets and strengths, they have capabilities, and the job of public services is to help them develop those capabilities, help them to exercise agency, help them to develop their own solutions. And that obviously links in very well with the idea of co-production and co-creation. So we've increasingly sort of focused on this idea of strengths-based approaches, and we see evidence of that in lots of the pilots that CoSIE has been involved in. I've only got in this presentation a brief overview of the key ideas, but in the full document online, you can also then see examples of some of these ideas and how they've played out in different pilots. But moving to this idea of strengths-based working raises a set of questions. What capabilities do people have? What capabilities should they have? How can organisations co-create asset-based services? What's the role of professionals in services if co-creation is taking place? How does the role of professionals change? And then at a national level, how do we scale promising local examples and turn them into larger scale services available to many rather than the few? And that has implications for the state. There are issues here around the relationship between citizens and the state, issues around rebuilding trust in public services that's probably been eroded over the last few years with a whole range of issues, including the 2008 financial crisis, COVID, Black Lives Matters, disability rights movement, people's lack of confidence in the state to address climate change. Whole range of factors have led to the erosion of trust. Can these kind of models create more trust? And one of the ideas in the paper that we've tried to explore around this is thinking through capabilities, the capabilities approach, pioneered by people like Sen and Nussbaum. How can that kind of model of thinking be used to help us better understand the idea of co-creation? And we've looked at various ideas there. Obviously, capabilities approach is well developed as a concept, and there are moves to try and apply capabilities, the capabilities approach to ideas of co-production and co-creation and strengths-based working. But we can probably go further, we think, in developing that theoretical framework. And what it really suggests is that we have to think about the moral dimension of co-creation, because once we start to talk about capabilities, once we start to talk about the capabilities people need to lead a good life, once we start to talk about the good life, we start to get into moral questions. And so a discussion about co-creation is inevitably a moral discussion. And how do we sort of ground a framework around capabilities and co-creation in a moral framework. So that's really one of our first insights that we highlight in the paper, this idea of co-creation as a moral endeavour. So this has been quite well expressed by Hilary Cottam in her book Radical Help, which is a set of case studies mostly from the UK, but not exclusively, where Cottam and colleagues have used strengths-based approaches in local communities to help people redevelop services, very much using a strengths-based approach. And towards the end of the book, Cottam starts to talk about the idea of capabilities theory being a good framework for thinking about co-creation. But what we think is perhaps missing to date is then a longer discussion about the kind of moral framework that implies for co-creation. And we've started to look at some more recent work, particularly by a Dutch philosopher also based at Utrecht, and his work, Klassen's work, starts to elaborate on the sort of moral framework for co-creation, or moral framework for capabilities theory, which we can then apply to co-creation. Our second insight really is around risk and the way in which services start to change the way they work when they adopt a co-created model of working and a strengths-based model of working. This was most apparent perhaps in the criminal justice pilot in the UK, but it was an issue that was relevant to a number of the pilots that CoSIE has been running. And this is the idea that if public services start to change the way they work and work with people in a strengths-based way, public servants have to change the way in which they work. So that doesn't mean that they should ignore risk, but it does mean that they should stop looking only at the risk people present with when they come to a service, and that they start to need to more clearly address people's underlying needs and draw on people's wider assets. So that implies a very different approach to managing risk in public services. And it's not just about risk, it's also then about issues around things like safeguarding and resource allocation, concepts that seem to sort of, in one form or another, permeate most public services in Europe very strongly. So second insight really is around this idea of rethinking how organisations and professionals delivering services approach risk. The third insight that we focused on was around some of the organisational implications of rethinking co-creation. So for organisations that are moving towards co-created services, clearly that implies different roles for staff. Staff have to recognise that the people they deliver services to also have valuable expertise by experience, perhaps, rather than expertise through training and professionalisation, but nevertheless an expertise. And so there needs to be a more equal relationship between staff and the people that they work with. It also means that people delivering frontline services need to be more outward looking, because if they're going to take a more holistic understanding of people's needs, they're probably going to work more in collaboration with partner agencies. And in turn, that potentially means different forms of organisation. So one thing that we're quite interested in is the potential for concepts like self-managing teams and the human learning systems model developed by Toby Lowe and colleagues at Northumbria to potentially provide different blueprints for thinking about how organisations that are delivering co-created services might organise themselves. Ruth Hannon at the RSA in the UK has been doing some interesting work on the use of self-managing teams in co-created services. She starts from this perspective that services have traditionally been developed to fix people's problems in the short term, and yet as we start to think about people's more complex needs and think about people more holistically, traditional organisational structures that public services have been organised around don't work as well, and we need to start to move towards different organisational forms. And following the work of people like Frederick Laloux and ideas of reinventing organisations, we can see new organisational forms emerging that maybe are more relevant. And we can also make some links here into the public administration literature and some of the work by people like Stephen Osborne around new public governance and the suggestions of a relational organisational structure being key to delivering public services. The fourth insight is around scaling up. So we know that there are lots of good examples of co-creation and co-production out there. The CoSIE project has supported a number of projects, local projects, to develop innovative models of co-creation, and there are others out there beyond CoSIE. But one of the key challenges very often in this field is how do we scale up good ideas that work in one locality with one group of people to become broader movements or broader services. And so this is where the social innovation literature is very useful. There's a long track record in social innovation of addressing this issue of scale up. In the paper, we make use of the sort of social innovation spiral that people like Jeff Mulgan have developed, which sort of sees projects starting as very small scale proposals and prototypes, but then gradually moving to being sustainable, and then through scaling up to systematic change or systemic change across whole sectors. And the challenge, of course, is that many projects never really get much beyond prototyping. So good projects tend to be very reliant on short-term funding, on charismatic individuals, individual social entrepreneurs, and therefore are hard to sustain and let alone to scale up. I think there's more work for us to do in this area, and as the pilots that we've been following start to come to the end of the period over which we're following them, maybe there's more for us to learn in the latter stages of the CoSIE project around scaling. But we've certainly been looking at different models of scaling social innovation and trying to think about what we can learn from those. For example, Albury et al. Have done a review and identified 2 types of enablers for scaling innovation. So for the people who are innovating in the pursuit of spreading innovation, there are potential opportunities to build demand through existing networks, use evidence to build demand, think carefully about the model that is being developed so that it's possible to have fidelity to a model as you move from prototyping to sustaining and scaling, trying to scale vehicles or organizational forms rather than simply relying on lone individuals, the sort of the classic social entrepreneur, the charismatic individual, trying to move beyond that. And then at a system level, a whole range of possibilities around using different policy drivers, regulatory systems, financial incentives to try and encourage effective models to move from prototyping to sustaining to scaling and eventually challenging whole systems to change. The human learning system that Toby Lowe and colleagues have developed also has promise in this area, emphasizes the idea of learning and moving from maybe sort of one-shot evaluations to ongoing iterative experimental approaches with rapid repeating trials and experiments to gradually build knowledge incrementally, thinking about then how that influences organizations and the ways in which learning is embedded within organizations, better use of data, creating a learning culture that allows people to make mistakes and to learn from those mistakes. So there's a whole range of possibilities there as well for scaling. And our final sort of main insight in the paper is around evaluation. So we know from previous reviews, such as the review by Vorberg and colleagues, that currently the evidence on co-creation is quite limited. There are lots of studies out there, but they're mostly small scale. They tend to be quite fragmented. Many of them are sort of case-based with very little potential to attribute effects. They're not really that kind of design, and so trying to build evidence around co-creation and co-production then becomes quite challenging. So we clearly need to think more about how we evaluate these kind of programs, and again through the CoSIE project we've learned more about good models of evaluation. We know that evaluation should probably be theory-led, starting with theories of change or logic models as a way of developing an understanding of what the intervention is and thinking about issues like fidelity to that intervention as we move through evaluation methods. We need multiple methods, mixed methods, methods that both capture people's experiences and allow people to get involved in co-producing research. If we're talking about co-production and co-creation, clearly we need to be thinking about how that filters through into the research that we do. And the People's Voice media work, for instance, has been a good example of that. But that doesn't rule out the fact that we can also start to think about how co-created approaches impact and deliver outcomes, and that implies that we still need to be thinking about counterfactual evaluation designs where attribution of effects is possible. That doesn't have to be randomized controlled trials. There are other counterfactual evaluation designs out there, and indeed there are case-based designs that also deal in attribution, QCA, contribution analysis, process tracing, a whole range of methods that use individual cases or small groups of cases, but are still trying to attribute cause and effect. And it seems that if we're really to scale co-created models of working, we do need to think about attribution. How do particular interventions or approaches deliver particular outcomes in particular contexts? So that's really our final insight. So that's a very quick run through of the paper. There's a lot in there. I've not been able to cover everything. but hopefully that's enough of a flavour of what's in the paper to encourage anyone who hasn't yet read it to have a look at it. And hopefully that's also a basis for some ongoing discussion about co-creation.